welcome back to Stephen King Month Part 2, and we are halfway done through this month, and I figure one of the best ways to celebrate Stephen King is by going back in time to the origin point of not only his writing career, but also of his film career. Yes, that's right, today we'll be talking about the 1976 version of Carrie. Now, for background on this film, the original book that this is based off of was Stephen King's first officially published novel. And his wife actually was the one that actually, told Stephen King, hey, I think you got something here, publish it. Essentially, Stephen King, for a long time prior to the writing of Carrie, was trying his best to get published, and he could not get it. And even with Carrie, he had a lot of doubt about it. But it wasn't until his wife read the manuscripts for Carrie that she was like, hey, Stephen, I think you got something here. You should publish it. And almost immediately, within about a year or so, the option rights for the Carrie, film license was put into place. And what Stephen King got out of it was actually kind of minuscule. He got about $2,500 for the film rights, which today would be like, wow, that's extensively cheap. But Stephen was so proud of that. And in fact, there was interviews that say that he was so proud of the fact that he finally got published and he finally, was able to have his work be, put onto film. And this film in particular, Carrie, definitely has some changes from the book. I will say that. The ending is much different. We'll get around to that in a moment, but let's actually talk about what this film is. So, this film was directed by Brian De Palma in 1976 and follows Carrie White as she is a emerging adolescent in high school. She is parented by a very religiously abusive mother. The people at her school are not necessarily the best kind of people, as most people in high school are kind of assholes to each other, or at least they make fun of each other. And with her emerging into, womanhood, she's finding herself to have more and more powers than her other, classmates. So, so this is basically the origin point of many Stephen King tropes. So you have the sort of, he's very anti-conservative religion in this book. Like, this is the first time in published history that he's been, outright against conservative values. This was the first time that, Stephen King put a telekinetic character into a book that has been since bastardized throughout the entire, bibliography and filmography of Stephen's career. Essentially, this is the whole origin point of his entire trope repertoire. Now, granted, not all of his tropes actually show up in this movie. Only a couple do, which is, subdued. Because nowadays, his tropes are pretty much everywhere. Which isn't necessarily bad. When I say that, when I say that there's, tropes of his that are put into this movie, I'm not saying that as a bad thing. I'm just saying, he has a very simple, way of telling stories. A lot of the times he likes to use children or teens that have telekinetic, or psychic abilities like Firestarter or Danny Torrance from The Shining, or even like the friends from Dreamcatcher, or just tons of different stuff. And Carrie was pretty much the origin point of all that. What really makes this film for me is Sissy It's Sissy Spacek? I have no idea how to say this name. But essentially Sissy Spacek pretty much makes the role of Carrie White. She has this ability to pretty much portray this sort of vulnerability for the character, as well as the ability to kind of shift into this sort of trance-like emotionless state where she uses her psychic powers. Granted, at times her powers come with a bit of her emotionality, but at other times she just kind of like stares off and just uses her psychic powers, just scarily, you know? Like there's a scene with, this paper boy, and he's calling names on Carrie. She just stands still, uses her psychic powers, just looks like this, you know? And Sissy Spacek, recently, this wasn't her only time with Stephen King. As of recently, she was in Castle Rock, the Hulu exclusive Stephen King series that is also set to return for season 2 in October. So I'm excited for that. As I mentioned before, she has this very religious mother, and it kind of contextualizes what the 70s and 80s were really about in terms of a revolution against tradition. What Piper Laurie does with the role of Mrs. White. She really commits to this role, by the way, where she's this very angry, very religious type person. There's this scene that happens before prom where Carrie has made this dress for herself, and yeah, it kind of accentuates her boobage, or her breasts, as, Carrie puts it. But she's just this very traditionalist thing, she's saying, oh yeah, they're all gonna laugh at you, Carrie, they're all gonna do this and that. And you can also tell by the sort of difference in appearance, because Carrie, is more of a new age, dress than what her mother does. Her mother has these gowns that are fully covering and whatnot. And there's other aspects to the relationship between Carrie and her mother that makes it all the more scary in terms of the religiosity of it all, and the conservatorium of it all. But Piper Laurie definitely helps to propel Carrie's progression inside of this whole story. Oh yeah, John Travolta's in this film. He's not really in it for that long. He just kind of plays this character that is just a boyfriend to this one popular chick. And essentially just envision Danny Zuko, but more of an asshole. He is just like a person who's willing to go through all these things. No. John Travolta is rarely utilized, and when he's on screen, he's okay. Pretty much the entire school is straight up just being assholes, right? The entire high school, like the opening scene, really emphasizes how how some people at this high school really treat Carrie. She is this outcast person, and everyone reacts to her just like as the weird person. Like when she starts to get her period in the shower at the beginning of the scene, or the beginning of the movie, everyone just starts making fun of her because she doesn't know how tampons work. She doesn't know what periods are. Honestly, she doesn't know anything about herself. That is right. From there, that we start to see more and more of a abuse of Carrie at the high school. And I think more of all, I think what this film really is kind of an anti-bullying, pro-sex ed type movie, I guess, if you want to put it that way. But not everyone at this high school is a pure asshole, because we do have, Miss Collins, who is a very sympathetic character to Carrie. She's pretty much she's the PE teacher in the film, played by Betty Buckley. So basically, her whole angle in this whole movie is that she's a person that wants to look out for Carrie, and her interests. She doesn't want her to be bullied, and thusly, there's this whole sequence with all the girls that made fun of her in the locker room, where they're put into a 50-minute detention, outside in the track and field, in the threat of, revoking prom tickets, because that's the huge thing for most of these people is prom. Even though my high school, some of us didn't even go to prom, but that's a different point. Must be a generational difference. And surprisingly enough, Betty Buckley also is not necessarily new to the horror scene, as of recently she was Dr. Karen Fletcher in M. Night Shyamalan's Split. So I think that's also really cool, by the way. There's a lot of themes in this film about emerging femininity. There's themes of conservatism, again, like conservative traditionalism versus expressionism. There's tons of things you could read out of it, but when you take that stuff off the table, it's still a film about a girl who's constantly bullied in high school. And it's, I think, in my opinion, it's kind of a tragedy of sorts. And I'll get to the reason why. The reason why is being that the entire prom sequence really plays to this sort of essence of tragedy. Prior to the pig blood spilling scene, her entire night is just, beautiful. It's accentuated by these beautiful, colorful shots of her and her date. And I can't remember the guy's name. I think his name was Tommy or something. But essentially, this whole thing leading up to it, even during the time when her and her date are going up on stage to get the prom king and queen announcement done, it's done to a sense, it's done with slow motion, as well as this sort of procession of, just dreamlike, just very dreamlike music, It's this moment of the movie where for once in the entire film, she's not judged. It's this one time in the film where she feels like she's the most safe. It's the one time in the film where she feels like she is, not feeling like she's being taken advantage of. It's the one time in the movie where she feels just safe and everyone just adores her. It's that one time, right? And even the date that she goes with starts to really, warm up to her as a person. I mean, granted, there was a scene earlier in the film where she says that his poem in one of the literature classes was actually beautiful, what he wrote. And so, it's just this setup, and it gives you this sort of false sense of security, because we as an audience know that there's something bad that's going to happen, but for her, it's not. And there's this huge tragedy that envelops with Carrie, I feel, when the shit hits the fan. And when the shit does hit the fan, it gets really awesome, because, once we get this, the pig blood just falls down, the bucket hits her date on the head, knocking him out. I think he's knocked out or he's dead. It's never really clarified by the end. It doesn't really have a full resolution of that sort of part. But that scene that envelops after that point, it's when the camel's, it's when the straw pretty much breaks on the back of the camel, essentially. She snaps. Essentially, she locks all the doors, the lights turn all blood red. We get to see this new side of filmmaking with the split screen sort of angle where she's looking in one frame, one part of the frame, and then we have the split screen of the reaction shots and whatnot. And and the way they actually have this shock, the way Carrie sees herself in this moment, there's these weird kaleidoscopes, making the entire thing seem dizzying, as, the sound of her mother is just saying, oh, they're all gonna laugh at you. They're all gonna laugh at you! 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 Oh, sorry, Cassie. It really accentuates this shock with Carrie, because she finally felt like she was safe, but then she was proven wrong, and so the entire auditorium just gets terrorized by Carrie as she makes her way outside, and the gymnasium or the auditorium, whatever it is, it starts to burn to the ground, and this is where we get to the ending, which I will say is a bit different, because the ending of the film it's very different. for many Stephen King loyalists, including King himself, they're not necessarily in for they don't want a lot of extraneous changes. And in the original book, I think in the book there was this ending that had a bunch of like meteors hitting the town because of Carrie's rage. And in the movie they changed it to where Carrie finally goes back to her mother to try to find some safety, because that was her point. That was her, point of origin. Like, even when her mother was abusive, there was still a supportive side of the mother. But she comes to find that her mother also doesn't want Carrie, by almost literally stabbing her in the back, and then, the mother dies. But this is where the biggest change comes in, because it's not the town that dies. Her entire house, Carrie's house and her mother's house, they're stuck in it, and it just kind of crumbles to the ground and sinks underneath. And the ending, I won't give away the final section of the movie, but I will say I still don't quite understand what it's supposed to mean, because it's this sort of fake-out dream sequence with one of the characters, and I'm not entirely sure what it's supposed to really represent. It's the one part of the movie where it just was kind of like, okay, what's really going on here? And they kind of just leave it off on this sort of like, ending that's supposed to be ambiguous, which I guess, if I was to give my opinion on it, I think Carrie's still alive. But some people say, oh, she's not alive, it's just a vision. I'm not entirely sure how to really feel with Carrie, in terms of the ending. But Carrie, as a movie, is still good. You still have some pretty damn good performances from most of the lead cast, from everyone from the PE teacher to Carrie herself, her mother, even some of the other girls that made fun of her are also really good, who got some careers after this movie. This movie is pretty good, I will say that. It doesn't really feel like it's dated. Granted, the mentality is a little dated around the subject of of periods and puberty and whatnot, but it's still a really well-made film with some pretty decent to sometimes good pieces of cinematography, really good lighting, really fun uses of the split screen editing technique, which I think this was one of the first films to really do that sort of technique. I could be wrong on that. Correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. Carrie is really good. And no, I'm not going to be talking about the sequel to Carrie, or the TV movie of Carrie, or the readaptation remake of Carrie that was done in the mid-2000s, because we don't have time for that, and I don't want to see the remake again. So, in that case, I highly recommend, if you are a Stephen King fan, this is your origin point right here. Carrie, good movie. Very good movie. Very well made. And I'm going to give Carrie an A-. Thank you guys so much for checking out Stephen King Month Part 2 of, whatever parts we do eventually. And next week, we'll be transitioning from movies over into television. And we're going to see how Stephen King makes his own television show. See you next week.